Since I was a girl, I was known by a title I didn't choose, but embraced with reverence, the pastor's daughter. That's what people called me, with admiration, respect, and often expectation. They expected from me a righteousness that mirrored my father's leadership, a sweetness that confirmed my Christian upbringing, and a composure that never revealed doubt or weakness. And I, out of love for him, out of love for God, fulfilled it all with diligence. I prayed when they expected me to pray, smiled when they expected me to smile, and said, "I'm fine," even when my heart quietly cried out for something I couldn't name. Faith never failed me. It was in every part of me, in my knees bent by the bedside, in the marked pages of my Bible, in the way my eyes searched for answers in the lines of Scripture. But over time, I realized there was a prayer rising from me without words, a silent prayer made of waiting. It wasn't loneliness or neediness. It was something deeper, a guarded longing held with respect, as if heaven itself had planted in me the promise of an encounter. I watched the other girls at church get swept away by smiles and compliments, giving themselves easily to the first boy who said the right things. But for me, it was different. Not out of arrogance, but because I knew from the beginning that my heart wouldn't surrender to just any touch, any voice. I needed something that came from above, something that was an answer, something that carried purpose, something that didn't just keep me company but knew me in my soul. And so I waited. As the years passed, as the flowers in our garden bloomed and withered in cycles that seemed to echo my inner seasons, I waited. No one knew. Not my mother, not my friends, not my diary. Only God. Only He knew that every night, between a psalm and a plea for peace in the world, I prayed, "Lord, if there is someone, let him come from your heart to mine." And for a long time, I heard nothing in response. But I never stopped believing. Because something in me, something I didn't fully understand, told me that when he came, I would recognize him. And then, on an ordinary night, one of those that arrives without warning and seems like any other, it happened. I closed my eyes to pray, as I had since I was a girl, and I was enveloped by a peace that didn't come from words, but from a presence. And soon, like a whisper in my soul, I was wrapped in an image so vivid that words fail to describe it justly. It was an open field, a golden sky, and a man walking toward me. He didn't speak. He just smiled. But his gaze said everything. He knew me, and I, without ever having seen him, knew him too. I woke with wet eyes and a heart in absolute silence. And in that silence, a certainty. God had answered, not with a distant promise, but with a vision, a direction. And even without knowing when or how, I knew something had begun there, and that, when the time came, love would arrive, as the fulfillment of something heaven had already written. In the days following that vision, everything around me seemed the same, and yet entirely different. The sun rose as always. Services proceeded with their sacred order. My mother continued preparing breakfast with her usual gentleness, and my father, with his firm yet kind voice, kept teaching about trust, obedience, and timing. But within me there was a new vibration, a kind of stillness that wasn't apathy, but reverence, as if I stood on the edge of something holy. I didn't tell anyone what I had dreamed. I kept it to myself, as if I had received a letter straight from heaven, one that shouldn't be read aloud. Everyone thought I was just more contemplative, more withdrawn, perhaps immersed in some fast or purpose, and in a way, they were right. But there was no formal sacrifice involved. Just a full surrender, a sharpened listening, a different kind of waiting. Now I wasn't waiting as before. I was awaiting. I began to notice details more closely. The leaves falling in the garden, the rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, the unfamiliar names in prayer requests. Everything seemed charged with hidden meanings. I started observing the faces around me more, trying to find, without forcing it, the smile I had seen in that dream. It wasn't curiosity, it was potential recognition. And I knew, with a peace I can't explain, that when he came, my heart would know. Still, I wrestled with the subtle fear of deceiving myself, of mistaking expectation for truth. But every time that thought arose, something greater silenced it. "My peace I give to you." The verse echoed in me like an anchor. Then, my father announced at dinner that we would attend a regional gathering of youth and spiritual leaders in a nearby city. He had been invited to preach and asked me to join him. I agreed naturally, not imagining that this would be the beginning of everything. The night before the trip, my heart beat differently. I dressed with more care, not out of vanity, but out of reverence for the moment, like someone preparing to meet something long awaited. The drive there was calm, but my spirit stirred within as if whispering, "Stay alert." And when we arrived, I saw hundreds of people gathered, each with their story, their journey, their pains, their purposes. But among all those faces, there was one I hadn't yet seen, and that deep in my soul, I already recognized. I wasn't searching. Not there, not at that moment. My heart was calm, surrendered. I entered the hall where the service would take place with a quiet spirit and lowered eyes, as I always did. I greeted the brothers with brief smiles, helped my father with papers and materials, and settled into one of the front pews. Everything in me was reverence. But then, in the middle of worship, as I absent-mindedly flipped through my Bible, waiting for the sermon to begin, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't noise, it wasn't emotion, it was presence, as if the air around me had changed in density. I lifted my eyes, and there he was. There was no glamour. He stood discreetly against the side wall of the hall, arms crossed, eyes attentive and serene. He wore simple clothes, but with dignity. And then he smiled. Not directly at me. It was a smile aimed at the person he was talking to, perhaps a church brother. But I recognized it. It was the smile from the dream, the one that pierced me without touching, the one that spoke of care, of peace, of something from above. My heart didn't race. It stilled, as if saying, "It's him." My eyes, fixed on him, for a moment too long, began to well up without warning. It wasn't exaggerated emotion, not infatuation. It was reverence. The same reverence I feel when the Spirit is present in prayer. I thought about looking away, about composing myself. But he saw me, and in that exact second when our eyes met, there was no shock, no surprise. There was recognition, as if two souls that had seen each other in another time, another plane, were finally meeting here. He didn't smile right away. He just looked at me, with focus, as if he too were seeking certainty. And then he smiled, this time for me. There was no doubt left. I turned my eyes forward. I gripped my Bible tightly. I pretended to be focused, but inside, everything in me trembled, not with fear, but with confirmation. The vision was real, and he was too. The dream I had guarded as a secret between me and God was now standing before me in the flesh. Reality had just become sacred. We didn't speak that night, and maybe that was for the best. My heart was still processing it all, like someone touching something holy for the first time, and needing time before naming what they felt. But he saw me. I knew that. And more than that, There was something in his gaze that said he knew too. Not with euphoria, not with doubt, but with the same stillness that had touched my spirit in the dream. When the service ended, Elijah left quietly. And I respected that silence, because when something is divine, it doesn't need to be rushed. I returned home with my body present, but my soul elsewhere, in constant prayer, in direct dialogue, and with heaven. Lord, if it's him, confirm. If it's not, calm me. But there was no restlessness, only peace. The days that followed brought what mature faith understands best, subtle movement. He appeared again, not once, but several times. And he didn't seek me out directly. He came with purpose, involved in church activities, group, prayers, conversations among leaders. But his eyes found me, always. It was a calm recognition, like someone who no longer needed to search, only to wait for the right time to approach. It was one afternoon, after a Bible study, that he sat nearby. The hall was almost empty. The voices in the background didn't stop me from hearing clearly when he said, "You're Lydia, right?" I looked at him and smiled, not with surprise, but with the smile that comes when the heart already knew. "Yes, Lydia Rosewood." He nodded and added, "I'm Elijah." We talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, and curiously, we barely spoke about ourselves. We talked about God, about purpose, about how hard and yet beautiful it is to wait for something without knowing when, where, or how it will come. He told me he had prayed for guidance in recent months, feeling that something new was approaching but not knowing what it was. When I heard him say that, my eyes filled with tears, not for the coincidence, because I knew it wasn't, but for the confirmation. In silence, I gave thanks, not for being heard, but for being guided. We began to meet more often, never alone, always surrounded by the community, ministry duties, spontaneous gatherings. But in every conversation, there was depth. In every glance, reverence. We weren't trying to build something impulsively. We were obeying something greater. And that kind of love doesn't rush, doesn't force, doesn't show off. It grows slowly like a root, steady, silent, and full of purpose. We started to know each other in layers. First, as brothers in faith, then as prayer partners, and finally, as two hearts that even without confessing, already knew they were being aligned for something greater. Our conversations spanned verses, life experiences, and memories guarded with modesty and reverence. Elijah was serene, but not passive. He had a firmness that didn't impose but sustained, and above all, he listened with his soul. When I spoke, even about the simplest things, he paid attention as if deciphering heaven's language in me. And that touched me deeply, because I knew he saw me, not as the pastor's daughter, not as a symbol of something sacred, but as a woman, as Lydia. It was during one of our long conversations, sitting in the shade of a tree behind the church, that I found the courage to share the vision. It wasn't easy. Part of me feared sounding fanciful or overly sentimental, but another part knew that if he was who my spirit already recognized, he would understand. And so, with a soft voice and a surrendered heart, I told him. I described the field, the golden sky, the smile, and then, the moment I saw that same smile here, in the real world. He didn't interrupt. He just listened with the same calm attention. As always, when I finished, he took a moment to respond, and then, with a steady yet almost breaking voice, he said, "Before coming here, I prayed for 3 weeks, asking God to show me clearly when the time was right, and I asked him to show me through someone who wasn't afraid to hear heaven. Silence, a full, dense, sacred silence. That's when I understood. What we were living wasn't just beautiful, it was an answer. It was divine construction. But not everything would be easy. Shortly after, Elijah told me about the volunteer mission he was about to accept, a year-long trip to serve a Christian community in another state. He had signed up before we met, driven by the same desire to serve that had guided him since, youth. And now, with the real possibility before him, he found himself torn between two callings that seemed, at first glance, incompatible: the ministry and me. That shook me inside. Not selfishly, but because in silence I had already begun to dream of his presence in my days, of the possibility of a future built together. And even though we hadn't made promises, there was a bond between us that could no longer be denied. He looked at me with sincerity and said, "I don't want to ask anything of you now. I just want us to pray." And that's what we did. For days, nights, in fasting and silence, we prayed, not for a convenient answer, but for one that was right. And it was in that place of prayer, not in romance, not in emotion, that we discovered that true love must be free enough to trust, even when the path seems uncertain. The confirmation of the mission came on a gray Monday. Elijah told me in person, with his usual serenity, but with slightly teary eyes. "They said they need me in North Carolina next month," he said. I tried to smile, to say something encouraging, to wear the strength I'd seen my mother use when life shifted course. But inside, something broke quietly. I knew he wasn't leaving me for lack of feeling, and that made it even more painful. It was like watching a piece of me obey a calling I wasn't part of. In the days that followed, our communication was made of pauses. We saw each other, yes. We continued the meetings, the conversations, the prayers, but there was a new presence between us. Time. The time that was running out. The time that pressed us. The time that posed a question I never wanted to answer. What if he goes and doesn't come back? Part of me, the most human part, wanted to ask him to stay, to not go, to choose the us that was forming between our hands. But the other part, the one that knew God's language, understood that true love sometimes means letting the other go, even if it hurts, even if there are no guarantees. It was on an especially quiet night, sitting on a bench in the square, that Elijah held my hand with more firmness than ever. "Lydia," he said, "I'm going. Not because I'm running from us, but because obeying what God asked of me is part of who I am. And I don't want to take you with me as an empty promise. I want us to stay firm here, in the same place of faith where it all began. Because if this love was given by Him, no distance can dissolve it. And if it wasn't, then we need to be strong enough to let it go." His words didn't wound me. They honored me. And in that moment, I understood what mature love is. A love that doesn't cling, doesn't demand, doesn't manipulate God's plans, but surrenders to them. We parted with prayer, not with vows, with calm tears, not with despair. And I, for the first time, discovered that waiting can be even deeper, when the love is already real, but needs to grow from a distance. That night, on my knees by the bed, I didn't ask for Elijah to stay. I prayed only, "Lord, if what we're living comes from you, guard it, sustain it, strengthen it, and bring it back in your time, because I don't want a love that depends on my will. I want one that depends on yours." The first days, without him, were quiet, but not empty. I missed his presence, of course. I missed the calm way he listened to me, the meaningful words he wove into simple conversations. I missed the certainty his gaze carried, the certainty that God was guiding everything. But curiously, as the days passed, I realized Elijah hadn't truly left. He remained, in prayer, in memory, in every verse I read, that reminded me why we began. He was far away, yes. But what bound us wasn't fragile. It wasn't made of routine, physical presence, or need. It was made of purpose. We kept in touch. Sparingly, but enough. Letters written in steady handwriting and words chosen with prayer. He told me about the families he served, the children he prayed with, the moments he felt longing, not just for me, but for the peace he had seen in my eyes. And I responded carefully, sharing with him the changing seasons, the Sunday services, the verses God brought to my heart in our silent nights. It was a different kind of exchange. There were no promises or set dates, but there was constancy. There was truth. As the months passed, I noticed something that changed everything within me. Even from afar, Elijah made me better. His memory made me more patient, more serene, more surrendered to God's will. I no longer waited for him like a woman waiting for a savior. I waited like someone who recognizes the beauty of something planted, now growing beneath the soil, invisible but alive. There were days when my heart ached, yes, but the pain was never bitter. It was like longing for something holy. And in those moments, I prayed, Lord, don't let me lose focus, not in time, not in feeling. If it's yours, care for it. And if it's not, teach me to accept with gratitude what I lived. The most beautiful thing of all was that I didn't feel alone. It was as if all of heaven accompanied this process, with me. God hadn't taken Elijah from me to prove something. He had given me time to be shaped. And I understood that this love, as human as it was also a form of worship. Because loving someone like Elijah, loving like this, from afar, on my knees, in silence and surrender, was in itself an act of faith. It was on a clear morning, one of those when even the breeze seems to pray with you, that something stirred within me. I woke with a different peace. Not the peace that calms a weary heart, but the one that precedes a fulfillment, as if my spirit knew something was about to happen before my eyes could see. I read Psalm 27 as usual, but when I reached the verse, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage," I wept. Not from sadness. It was a weeping of understanding, because in that moment I realized that the waiting itself had transformed me. I was no longer the Lydia Elijah had met months ago. I was steadier, lighter, more whole. That same afternoon, I received a letter. It wasn't just from him. It was about him. The pastor of the church that had welcomed him wrote to say that Elijah would complete his mission the following month and would return to our region for a leaders' gathering. The detail, however, came at the end. "He has spoken of you with a rare kind of honor. He said that if it's God's will, he hopes to see you again soon." I closed my eyes, the letter in my hands. I felt as if I were being enveloped by something not of this world. It wasn't just an answer. It was a promise being remembered. I didn't jump for joy or rush to share the news. I just breathed deeply and said, "Lord, I know your time is now." In the days that followed, I returned to the places where we used to talk. I sat on the square's bench. I lingered longer in the church garden, all without haste, all in prayer, not out of anxiety, but out of reverence. I didn't want the reunion to be magical. I wanted it to be sacred, because what we were living wasn't just any story. It was a testimony. And then, a week later, I saw his name on the event poster, Elijah Brooks. Confirmed. It was real. He was coming back. Not to promise me anything, not to repeat the past, but to see with his own eyes what God had preserved between us. I still didn't know how it would be, what we would say, what we would do. But I knew, with all the conviction of my spirit, that when he saw me, and I saw him, everything that had been upheld by faith would find its place in time. The day arrived without fanfare. No grand expectations, no celestial signs. Just a Saturday with a clear sky, a gentle breeze, and a ready heart. I wore my light blue dress, the one my mother once said made my eyes look steadier, and went to the event with a silent heart, like someone approaching an altar without knowing what will be said, but certain it will be eternal. When I arrived, I saw many people gathered, voices in worship, hands raised, smiles that seemed to light up the morning, but my eyes searched for only one. And when they found him, everything within me stilled in a way only God can do. There he was, standing, stronger, more mature, with the same steady gaze and restrained smile. Our meeting wasn't like the movies. It was better. It was real. We walked toward each other without stumbling, without haste. When we stood face to face, we didn't say hi. We just smiled, as if the months had been merely a comma in a story that never lost its meaning. He looked into my eyes for a few long seconds and said, "You're still the answer God showed me, and now I can choose to stay." We stood there in silence, surrounded by people who didn't notice what was happening, and that was perfect. Because what God does doesn't need an audience, only obedience. We sat together, prayed together, and later we walked as we always did, talking about the small things. And it was there, between a soft laugh and a spontaneous touch, that he asked if I still dreamed of that golden field. I smiled. Yes, but now it smells like real life. The love between us was no longer a future promise. It was present. It wasn't illusion or expectation. It was choice. We decided to continue, with prayer, with conversation, with respect, without haste, but with direction. And every day that followed was a quiet confirmation that when God unites two hearts in His time, no distance, fear, or waiting can unravel what was stitched from above. Today, when I look at Elijah beside me, silent on the porch with a Bible in his lap, or watching me as if still enchanted, I understand. The dream wasn't just a vision. It was an invitation, a glimpse of something that already existed in God's heart, even before I knew what to ask for. And now, I live within it. I used to think waiting was passive, that it meant just sitting, praying, and hoping. But now I understand. Waiting on God is a process of transformation. It wasn't just Elijah who came to me. I also had to come to myself. Every day of prayer, every sustained silence, every overcome doubt shaped not just the path, but the woman who today loves fully, wholly, and in peace. Elijah wasn't the reward for my faith. He was part of it. The love we live isn't perfect, but it's founded on the rock. And every day we pray together, every day we choose each other is a testimony that God doesn't just listen. He answers in His perfect time. And when love comes as an answer, it doesn't come to fill us. It comes to overflow.